Buenas tardes. Good evening, everybody. Again, those of you that are logged on right now, thank you for joining us instead of watching the presidential debate. I appreciate that. I appreciate your sacrifice and your commitment to your craft. Y una vez más, quería también compartir el folleto de esta noche, por si no lo han bajado del Google Classroom. As a reminder for anybody that is watching on any of the live streams, you can get full access to the handouts if you completely enroll using Google Classroom. You can go to our website at distillarts.org/Conchas y Café zine to completely enroll. Es gratis. There is no fee, and Google Classroom doesn't require you to have a Gmail account, so you can use any email address that you like. On TikTok for the rest of the week. Yeah, it'll be on TikTok, at least parts of it. And then this recording will also be on our YouTube channel forever. All right. So, para empezar, as is our custom, we like to start off with a quote. So aquí les voy a presentar el folleto de esta noche y la cita que típicamente usamos para empezar las sesiones. Esta vez viene de Eduardo Galeano. Eduardo Galeano, for those who are not familiar, is an Uruguayan journalist, writer, and novelist considered, among other things, global soccer's preeminent man of letters and a literary giant of the Latin American left. Y aquí, como ven, tenemos una cita de él que dice, en inglés, he who writes sows. Text comes from the Latin textum, which means textile. With strings of words, we go about speaking. With strings of time, we go about living. All text is like us, textiles that move. Y aquí también en el chat se los estoy subiendo en inglés. And in Spanish, the quote says, quien escribe teje. Texto proviene del latín textum, que significa tejido. Con hilos de palabras vamos diciendo, con hilos de tiempo vamos viviendo. Los textos son como nosotros, tejidos que andan. And again, viene de Eduardo Galeano. So what does this particular quote say to you? ¿Qué piensan al escuchar o al leer esta cita de Eduardo Galeano? You can use the chat if you prefer using the chat. You can raise your hand if you'd like to share that way. And if you're on either Instagram Live, YouTube Live, or Facebook Live, you can use the chat there as well. ¿Qué opinan? And keep in mind, there's no right or wrong answer. It's really just how you interpret it. ¿Qué dices, Sam? ¿Qué te hace
Digo
pensar?
que me provoca la idea de que somos lo que escribimos, que los textos son como nosotros y la relación entre una vida humana y un texto es algo vivo, algo cargado de experiencias que, aunque tal vez se trate de ficción la obra, están basados los sucesos en cosas de la vida real. Oh, just the relationship between texts as fictional products, so to speak, and an actual human life. I think it's speaking to the fact that we write ourselves into existence. Our language brings us to life. The things that we write record our lives, even if even if it's fiction, it's still based, it comes from somewhere rooted in reality.
Yeah, I like that. I like how you are, making the connection between reality and the way that our words can maybe manifest the reality, right? Or vice versa. And in the chat, Julie writes, writing, talking, and language is interwoven into our lives, our relationships. I would definitely agree. And Aurea writes, Eduardo talks about how to create with our words. Definitely. Abraham wrote in the chat, I like how it conveys the mixing of on a pattern of words which we decide, and how all are alive and still moving. Yeah. And then Ciel added in the chat, to me, this quote reminds me that our lives and experiences are interwoven with our words and vice versa. And Julie also added, language holds culture. Absolutely. There's definitely a lot of ways to interpret this, right? You know, the text itself, the idea or the concept of text, the idea that it maybe is, you know, similar to the concept of textiles, and how textiles can be things that we create, that we fabricate, you know, and text is obviously something that we create, we fabricate through the process of writing. You know, there's a lot of connections that are being made there, both literal and figurative, ¿verdad? And to think of all of us como seres tejidos, I think that that's a really fascinating way of thinking about our relationship with text and textiles and fabrics, ¿verdad? Because we are in our own way constructed of the stories that we tell, que no? ¿Hay otra opinión? Is there another idea or thought that comes to mind when you read the Eduardo Galeano quote? And again, there's no right or wrong answer.
When we don't think how we're living, we get how you say nudos.
Mhm.
You get your energy doesn't flow, and you get stuck, and then you take time because you're like, I don't remember how to say noodles. You make noodles with your life, and then to continue, you have to get back to the energy to continue
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
creation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
Noodle knots, right? And just to be clear, anybody can share in whatever language they feel most comfortable sharing. So, como hablamos ambas idiomas aquí, típicamente, you know, we code switch. So, hablamos, a veces mochado, I'll say. um, pero yeah, I think Aurea makes a great point. You know, cuando tenemos algo que nos está bloqueando, a veces decimos o tenemos ese dicho, ¿verdad? Que nos estamos haciendo nudos, where we're kind of making ourselves a knot. And I think that it's a fascinating way to think about how life can sometimes be like a fabric, or like un hilo, a string. Lo que le salga, exactly, Sam. Thank you. Salga como salga. Um, the computer is based on X and O, which came from building textiles, which, yes, we do move with now. The computer connects us to the world. Absolutely, Julie. Thank you for adding that in the chat. It is interesting to think about that, right? The the binary of on and off, or the binary of over or under in the case of textiles. I love the connections that you're all making. Es fascinante escuchar cómo se forman sus conexiones, ¿no? Entre todos aprendemos. So, of course, you know, we're here to talk about writing specifically. And I think, you know, in order for us to be able to talk about writing and how to analyze poetry and how to analyze the type of work that's presented here, I think it's good for us to have kind of like a baseline, ¿no? Y por eso aquí les presento una serie de palabras. And we don't have to go through all of them, you know, but if you have a question about them, you're more than welcome to ask, or an opinion about them. Pero como ven aquí, este vocabulario que les estoy presentando en el momento es lo que yo llamo la materia prima de poesía. These are the building blocks of poetry. And that includes things like prose. For us to talk about poetry, we have to acknowledge the importance of prose, right? Yeah, it's kind of like a poetry 101. Exactly, Abraham. And the theme for this class, for the series, I should say, is life's paths, los caminos de la vida. And San Juanita, you may be asking because you probably recognize that we've actually gone over this quote before. Eduardo Galeano is familiar to us aquí in Conchas y Café.
If you allow me,
Yeah.
I don't want to interrupt, but when I was having a hard time finding the class,
Uh,
I didn't get the code or anything, so I was going all over, and I'm like, no, I can't miss it. And when I opened it and I saw Eduardo Galeano, I'm like, oh, okay, a familiar name, and that's good because I wasn't sure what the theme was going to be for this particular. But I love the theme, life's paths.
yeah.
Really, tongue twister, life's
Yeah.
life's paths.
Life's
Yeah,
path.
but it's good, and I'm happy to be back. Honestly,
Yeah. Welcome back. It's good to
I
have you.
missed it.
Yeah.
I missed.
And of
So-
course, we at least Abraham and I, when we were discussing the theme, we both thought of the song. No, there's a few famous songs, that invoke the idea of caminos en la vida. But we're starting off today's session with just a little primer, ¿verdad? Este es like la fundación, ¿verdad? De la poesía. So we're going to talk a little bit about, like I said, some of these vocabulary words that we talked about a little bit last week as well. Empezando con prosa, ¿verdad? Prose is the way that most people write. It's the more standardized way of writing, I guess you could say. Es la forma ordinaria, la prosa. Y luego existe poesía. Y poesía puede tomar varias formas. There's no really correct or incorrect way of writing poetry. But the basic definition of poetry is the art of rhythmical composition, whether that's written or spoken. That's why spoken word poetry exists, and that's why also prose exists, and why campfire stories exist. It's because it's a way in which we communicate, ¿verdad? Pero poesía es distinto porque tiene algo o debería de decir, tiene considera la composición, right? There's rhetorical devices that are used in poetry that make it poetry. But it's also good to understand just the basic elements of language, como el sustantivo, noun. It's a person, a place, a thing, or what I like to think of it as a state of being or a quality, right? These are other things that we don't always think about when we think about nouns, but those are also considered nouns, which if we think about a noun as being a state of being, we can also think of metaphor, right? La metáfora también es una forma de ser, right? It's a state of being, but as is another, como ven aquí. Así es como me gusta pensar en metáfora, which is probably one of the key components of creating poetry is metaphor. But metaphor doesn't work only in poetry. This also works in visual art, obviously in prose because of its basis in writing. Pero también se puede usar metáfora como en música o en hasta en cómics. O sea, diferentes formas de arte usan metáfora para contar su cuento, para reforzar su cuento. All of these tools are really important for us to understand in order to reinforce the stories that we're telling. Poetry tells a story. It might be a short little story, like a vignette of a moment in time, but it's still a story. Y así también es importante saber lo que es un verbo, lo que es un adverbio. All of these other elements of grammar are always good for us to remember. We learn a lot of these in our early life. We learn them sometimes without even realize we're learning them because it's just a way that we speak. Y igual como aprendemos a hablar, podemos aprender cómo escribir poesía. So these are your basic building blocks. Does anyone have any particular questions about any of the words that you see here? A lot of these, I think, like I said, we've learned already in just our lifetime. But does anybody want to have maybe a better idea of what one of these words might be, what one of these parts of grammar might be? ¿Me gustaría un ejemplo, por ejemplo, de un adverbio? ¿Les ayudaría saber un poquito más lo que es una preposición? I feel like people get hung up sometimes on the idea of a preposition. We'd like to know a little bit more about metaphor, of course. So I kind of anticipated that, and I wanted to actually share an example of a metaphor. And if we look at the quote itself, right? Aquí lo tienen de nuevo. The quote has all of these elements, practically all of these elements, ¿verdad? Metaphor, again, is one of the main tools that we use in poetry and in all other forms of art. Metáfora, en este caso, en el caso de la cita, se puede claramente ver en en la descripción de un textil, right? The textile in this particular quote is the metaphor, because the textile itself is being used to essentially compare what life is like, right? We all are textiles that move. Now, obviously, we're not a literal textile. I am not made of fabric, even if I'm flat on your screen right now. I am a, flesh, live human being on the other side of your screen. So in that way, textile, AI, me, yeah, thanks, Abraham. But textile here is acting as a metaphor for how we are these things that move, right? These strings of time, these strings of words, right? That is how metaphor functions. It's a way of creating a state of being when you want to use a different type of object to compare another object, right? As you see here, it's an analogous relationship. You might also think of metaphor in phrases, very common phrases like the land of milk and honey. Most people are familiar with that phrase in reference to a promised land out of the Bible. Right? The land of milk and honey is not literally a land made out of milk and honey, but it's a land that uses milk and honey as a way of talking about the bountifulness. You see? So that is how metaphor functions within all forms of art. Are you getting hungry, Abraham? I like how Sam wrote in the chat, we're all walking books. Es cierto. How does the saying go? Cada cabeza, cada cabeza su propio mundo, or something like that. So
Cada cabeza es un mundo.
yeah, something like that. Cada cabeza es su mundo. Obviamente en español, literalmente no tenemos una cabeza que es igual de tamaño o igual de grande como un mundo, ¿verdad? Igual como la Tierra, por ejemplo. Pero siendo metáfora, básicamente quiere decir que cada persona, cada ser es distinto. Cada persona tiene su propia mentalidad, su propia personalidad. Y en este caso, en ese dicho, el mundo es metáfora de eso, de lo que hace un individual, ¿verdad? Yeah, o sea, cada quien es diferente. Exactly. So that's how a lot of times you will hear metaphor used in our everyday life. You'll hear it in these typical phrases that we use throughout our day. It's raining cats and dogs. It's, I don't know, insert your phrase there. Does anybody else have another example of how we use metaphor every single day?
Can I just we use it I've used it in my classes for the longest time. And basically, and I always, put simile and metaphor, right? Because that way I want the kids to see the difference. So the difference between similes, both are comparisons. You're comparing two things, right?
Yeah.
But with a simile, you use the word like or as, right? And with metaphor, you don't. So I say, life is like the beach, Now, without like, you would say life is a beach, So you're comparing, right?
Mhm.
But in one you're saying like, and the other one you're not.
Right.
En español, ahorita batallé un poquito, porque casi en español no lo uso tanto.
Yeah.
Pero es todavía una comparación,
Mhm. Mhm.
Eres mi mundo. I mean, it's not true, Eres mi mundo, eres mi sol, eres mi whatever,
Yeah.
Y no quiero porque voy a empezar a hacer un poema, empezar a escribir un poema.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's the way I try to put it in my head so I remember it.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's a perfect way of doing it. It's I think easier in English to describe a simile compared to Spanish, because in Spanish I feel like we tend to speak in more absolutes. Pero pues cada quien, ¿verdad? Dr. Rosie, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah, I don't know why it came to my mind, but like you're talking about life, that movie where Gump, when he says life is like a box of chocolates, you
Mhm.
don't know what you're gonna get in them, and it's a very nice metaphor
Mhm.
or simile,
Yeah.
So I that always stayed with me, and it's true.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Totally classic, yes.
yeah, it's definitely a classic. And the way that say San Juanita was describing it, right? Life is like a box of chocolates. If you remove the like, then you'll see that life is a box of chocolates, right? So the fact that it is that way again goes back to the way that I personally like to think of metaphor. It's a state of being as another, right? It's a state of being. So in a lot of ways, it makes it like a noun, right? A noun is also a state of being. So to me, it's an easy way to think about metaphor. ¿Había otra pregunta or another comment about any of the vocabulary?
Yeah, Luis,
Yes.
Luis, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
don't know. Okay. So, you were talking about it being like a noun, a person, a place. So when I wrote, people tell you the world is your oyster. I mean, is that a metaphor? I'm just kind of confused about that.
Yeah, the world is your oyster. That would be a metaphor, right? Oyster being the substitute for the world being or life being yours for the taking. Um, and the reason why it would be a metaphor is because the oyster can't move. The oyster is an easy target. The oyster is a, uh, resource in terms of nutrition. So there's a lot of different ways that the oyster can be used to compare life to something that is there for you. And if you turn around and say there are a lot of bad oysters, that would be just building on the metaphor. And that's where I think poets are able to start using metaphor as a tool for telling a story, right? It is an idiom, as Sam is pointing out, un modismo. Estos dichos existen porque ayudan pues básicamente darnos un nuevo entendimiento de la vida. Right? Idioms exist because they help us explain certain things in life in a maybe more captivating way, in a more interesting way, in a way that just sticks out with us more, right? So that's where metaphors really shine, when we get to use them to tell a story in an engaging way. Ese básicamente es el punto de contar cuentos, ¿verdad? De tener a gente sea riéndose o llorando de tristeza porque el cuento les llega al corazón. Siempre es nuestra meta llegar al corazón de la audiencia. And so, if we think about our jobs as poets, as writers, as artists, to try and always get to people's hearts, for them to have an emotional reaction, then that means that we're being effective in our storytelling. We're being effective in our communication. And yeah, that is the purpose, to spice it up, as Abraham says. So, and that's why we use these skills. Exactly, San Juanita, exactly. Figurative language, right? So, does anyone have any other additional questions related to these? I'd like to give you all a chance to use some techniques in a moment. So before we get into a little exercise, I want to also share with you some advanced techniques in poetry. And these will go a little bit more one by one para que los entiendan un poquito mejor. So, estas técnicas de poesía, técnicas avanzadas, they're really not that advanced, especially when you think about just how easy it is to do them when you're writing. These things, while being advanced, it's not so much about being advanced. It's about again, just being an effective communicator. And it starts with something as simple as the line break, right? This is all about the structure that our poetry can take. Las estructuras que usamos para la poesía empiezan con el salto de línea, ¿verdad? Y es lo que la mayoría de gente reconoce como poesía. This right here, this particular structure, is what a lot of people will associate with poetry and rhyming, but you know, rhyming isn't always going to be poetic. You can rhyme or you cannot rhyme, is basically what I'm saying. Pero para que vean aquí, el salto de línea or the line break is just simply exactly what it sounds like. The moment where a line ends in a line of poetry. So here I wrote this little mini poem for you. It just reads, nights tie temporal life strings, enclosing errant fibers, forming karmatic time loops. Y en español, dice, nudos anudan a hilos temporales de la vida, encerrando fibras errantes, formando lazos karmáticos de tiempo. Y como ven, el punto final de cada línea, you know, usually will have a very clear stop. Sometimes you can reinforce it using a comma. Sometimes you can leave no comma, no punctuation. It depends really on your style. This would be my particular style of writing this type of line break. ¿Verdad? My personal favorite technique, though, is enjambment. And one of the things that, at least in my study of poetry, I learned was that for me and for a lot of contemporary poets, enjambment is a way of using almost like the concept of poetry in single lines of poetry, right? Cada línea de poesía, cada renglón, para mí es un poema. Es como un mini poema. Y por eso a mí me gusta usar encabalgamiento para formar ideas distintas o, ¿cómo diría mejor? Pues juxtaposiciones, which is probably the, you know, a good transition into the third word that you see here. So you create juxtapositions when you use enjambment. And it's also performed differently, which is another thing that I personally like to do when I'm performing my poetry. Como en este ejemplo, si notan, son las mismas palabras. This is the same exact little poem that you see up here. Right? There is no difference, just a difference in the way that the lines are structured. So it reads, knots tie, temporal life strings enclosing, errant fibers forming, karmatic time loops. Granted, the words that I use may be a little difficult to understand, but it's not so much about that, right? Because now we have lines like this one, errant fibers forming. You know, the concept of an errant fiber, una fibra errante. Esa es una imagen que tenemos, que se nos presenta, ¿verdad? Pero En la misma línea, tenemos a la palabra formando. And forming implies a particular image of these errant fibers, even though the grammar is not what, that relationship is trying to imply. Because here we have enclosing errant fibers. That is the actual grammatically correct phrase, right? Las fibras errantes se están encerrando, right? Encerrando fibras errantes. Gramáticamente, sintácticamente, eso es lo que estoy diciendo en este pedazo de poesía, ¿verdad? En esta pieza. So, si tenemos aquí la juxtaposición de esas fibras errantes encerradas, ahora tenemos, en este caso, el refuerzo de que están formando, right? In this particular case, these enclosed errant fibers, the word forming is reinforcing that particular image of the errant fibers because of the way that the enjambment is being used. It's, like I said, a little more advanced, but it's really not that advanced when you start looking at this and you start practicing it more. Does this concept make sense to everyone? I don't know if I did a great job of explaining it right now. But what does it do for you when you read this one compared to this one? Like sins or mistakes equals errant fibers. Yes. And it is a thought-provoking image. Thank you, Sam. Is anyone confused? But a lot of this ultimately comes down to is using juxtaposition, right? That's what poetry likes to use, and that's where poetry really excels, right? Because juxtaposition is a function of metaphor. It's a way to contrast ideas. Correct. Thank you, Abraham. And just to be clear about what juxtaposition is, it's when you use two or more things side by side to create either contrast or an interesting effect, right? We don't always see things like, particular colors with natural colors, right? We're not going to say like I don't know, lime green in the context of like, say, I don't know, maybe like the ocean. That's not a common image, right? But when you do that together in a single line, you create juxtaposition. Jess, do you have a question or a comment that you think might help with the explanation?
I don't know that would help. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. But I was reading the definition in there, but I feel like with the line break, it says it in the definition, but in the line break, when you read it, it sounds like a point made. Like, oh, that he has a point there. Whereas in enjambment, when you read it with enjambment, I feel like it's like more of like, is he trying to say something and I don't get it? Or it's vague. That's how I read it. I'm like, oh, okay, shit, that makes sense. Like, not our life strings that come together, blah, blah, blah. And then with the other one, it's more like you get it, but you have to
work for it.
Think. Yeah, you have to, which makes sense. You have to think, and you have in the definition thought. You have to think about it. So you could tell it's someone's thought versus it's someone's point they're trying to make. That's not how I read it. That's all.
Yeah, and that's one way to think about the way that we use line breaks. Most people will make a statement and stop, right? And that's fine. If that's how you write poetry and that's how the messages are going to get across, and then you do that. Enjambment is going to make you work a little bit more. But part of the reason why we want our audience to work a little bit more to get the satisfaction of understanding our metaphors is because of this tool, right? It is because of juxtaposition. It's not every day that we see things put together or phrased in a unique way, ¿verdad? I mean, we are already trying to communicate messages a lot of times that are maybe making comparisons that don't always exist. We hear life is a box of chocolates. We hear, other dichos on a regular basis. but we're trying to create our own, right? We're trying to be creative in our use of language. So if we go back up here to, like say Eduardo Galeano, if we were to write that out as a poem, we could potentially write this as one line, right? He who writes sows. And then with strings of words we go, right? That could be another line. About speaking with strings of time. That could be a single line as well, right? And that's how you can then start to break down what is written in prose into a form that most people will then begin to understand as poetry. And then you have that flexibility of being able to create new images that people aren't used to seeing. And using these different techniques of juxtaposition, enjambment, and just basic line breaks, that's how we can start to get people more engaged in what we're writing.
Can there be a poem that has all those three techniques in one?
Yeah. Yeah, these don't live by themselves. Cada uno de estas técnicas existen juntos. Así que se pueden intercambiar. You can flip back and forth. You can incorporate all of these things all at once. That's partly what juxtaposition here is doing, right? This example. Because you see, knots tie temporal, that is an enjambment because ultimately you're trying to go to the next line to get the full word, right? Knots tie, or the full phrase, knots tie temporal life strings. A cambio en español, si uno lo lee en español, se forma diferente el encabalgamiento. Ya viene siendo en este ejemplo más como un salto de línea tradicional, right? Nudos anudan a hilos. That in itself sounds a lot more like a straight up line break because it's making a declarative statement. It's not trying to get you to go to the next line the way that enjambment does. So that's another thing too. If you are writing in both English and Spanish at the same time, you can use the ways in which we understand our language in a variety of ways, right? To tell your story. That's why if you're bilingual, sometimes you have more artillery in your, toolkit to get your stories across. I like how Sam put it. Think of what's being enjammed as snapshots, if that helps. You're meant to linger on those parts and see how it changes your reading of the grammatically standard lines. Exactly. It's about kind of challenging your reader to be like, wait, what did I just read? So they go back and then they really think about it. Oh, okay. We're talking about life as a string. Got it. Jess?
So if you were to use one line, like the to be or not to be, which one would you think that would be? Which technique? If you were just to read that line. Just curious.
To be or not to be?
Mm-hmm.
That is the question.
Yeah.
The way that it's performed to me would sound like a standardized line break, right? Because standardized line breaks I guess standardized line breaks, right, can follow more the traditional grammar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it was written on paper as an enjambment, you could still do, enjambments and also read it in standard syntax, right? It's just more the visual way. Enjambment is more of a visual tool to get us to stop and think about our poetry and think about the words that we write, that we read.
Okay.
So yeah, if it helps, you can think of this as a visual technique, whereas this is more of like a performance technique. Is there any other questions or any other insights, since all of you are poets and you have used these things without sometimes realizing it? Yeah, it is a bit more surreal to use enjambment, and that is how you can juxtapose words together. Exactly. Julie does make a great point in that way, right? That's why these are on here as sort of partner devices. they exist together in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different forms of poetry. And a line break is just the simple way of calling any one of these, right? This is still a line break. It's just a specific type of line break, an enjambment. It's a specific kind of line break. Yeah. I could show one of my poems, I guess. I would have to look one up, though, and I didn't come prepared with that specifically. But thank you, Aurea. Aurea looks like wrote a poem in the chat. Aurea escribió: El cansancio me hace trastabillar cuando apenas me he podido parar, ergida en el caminar de mi vida. So here, trastabillar y parar, obviamente rima, ¿verdad? They rhyme, and they're at the end, at least visually, in my chat section of Zoom. Trastabillar y parar son el momento, el punto final de cada renglón para mí. Y esos vienen siendo los saltos de línea. And then, the way that Aurea has structured the little poem, is using these techniques in different ways. So, gracias, Aurea, por darnos un ejemplo. And really, in the end, kind of like as Aurea says in the chat, you should always write for yourself, right? You have fun experimenting with these different techniques. They're being presented to you specifically for that, for you to explore with them and to try them out so that they maybe, become part of that toolkit that I was talking about. Y ahora para seguirle. Quiero que practiquen un poco. So, what I'd like you all to do, como ven aquí, es que quiero que me escriban una estrofa de 4 líneas que usa palabras selectas de la cita de Eduardo Galeano. Y también quiero que utilicen una de las 3 técnicas de salto de línea en su estrofa. I'm going to put the directions here in the chat. I want you to write a 4-line stanza that uses select words from Eduardo Galeano's quote and incorporate also one of the 3 line break techniques that we just covered. Again, write a 4-line stanza that uses select words from Eduardo Galeano's quote and incorporate one of the 3 line break techniques into your stanza. Y aquí les voy a presentar otra vez, tal vez porque este está más grande, la cita de Eduardo Galeano. So pick and choose the words from here that you want to try and incorporate, but try writing a 4-line stanza. And I'll give you, let's go for a full 5 minutes. You can add your stanza to the chat if you like. If you want to try to do the line breaks in Zoom in the chat, I believe you need to do a shift return. So that way it doesn't send the chat. It creates what's called a soft return. And for those of you that are joining in on Instagram Live or any of the other lives that we have, you can also use the chat feature there. You can share your 4-line stanza that incorporates select words from Eduardo Galeano's quote. All right. Thank you, Abraham. I like that you took the first sentence from Eduardo Galeano's quote and you turned it into a 4-line stanza. It reads, "He who writes sows." Text comes from the Latin textum, which means textile. At least that's how I would perform it. Yes. Yes. Of course, you can incorporate your words as well. 5 minutes are up. Si no terminaron, no hay problema. If you'd like to share what you did write, you can put that in the chat. Thank you, Jess. Jessica wrote, "He who sows sings. To she who strummed the strings, truly knows living life can be good without texting." Nice, nice. And so I'm purposely, by the way, I'm purposely stopping at the end of the lines so that you can hear how the line break makes the poetry sound. Si él nos escribió, he who writes sows, like mangroves rooted in the water, kissing the depths of strings of words. Like that. And we have actually a simile going on there, sows like mangroves, followed by a metaphor, rooted in the water. Mangroves rooted in the water, kissing the depths. Excellent job, Ciela. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you, Jessica, for sharing yours as well. Anyone else have anything they'd like to share in the chat? Or maybe you would like to read it out loud for us? Thank you, Julie. Would you like to read yours out loud, Julie?
Sure, I will. I leave strings of time to the elders. I leave streams of thoughts to the miners. I leave time to the women waiting. For me, it's too late to sow.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. Y ahora, gracias por compartir. ¿Gustaría leer este poema, mini poema, que nos puso en el chat?
Ok. No sé si sigue mucho de las técnicas, pero ok. Me ando poniendo zancadillas, mitad queriendo y no queriendo, y últimamente hasta sin querer. Es que ya se me ha hecho costumbre hacerme caer. No duro ni un poco volando alto. ¿Qué diría mi querido cóndor de mí? ¿Qué pensaría él si supiera que me ando tirando piedras a mí misma?
Excelente. Gracias, Aure. I like the use of rhyme. You know, rhyming is a lot easier, I think, in Spanish. Por eso, en parte, me gusta escribir más en español que en inglés, pero yeah, I like the way that it sounds. De las técnicas, no se preocupe de eso, porque eso es lo que van aprendiendo, ¿verdad? Es algo que, especialmente en el chat de Zoom, no es tan fácil usar las técnicas de salto de línea, pero sin embargo me gusta cómo suena su poesía, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing more in the future. So ya que
Gracias.
practicaron, de nada. San Juanita, I see that you used a couple different techniques.
I was too stingy with the words.
Yeah, I like it. Do you want to read it out loud for us?
Yeah, sure. Di con hilos de palabras. Vive con hilos del tiempo. And you know, I wasn't sure about the punctuation at the end. Di, coma, ¿verdad? Comma. Con hilos de palabra. Period, I guess. Y vive, coma, con hilos del tiempo. Punto.
Yeah. See, that's the nice thing about poetry is that you don't have to use the correct grammar, so to speak. You don't have to use commas. You don't have to use periods.
But to make
because your line breaks can function
Pero
in
para que
the
tenga un
way.
efecto, ¿verdad?
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
como,
you're right.
como
You're
para
right.
dar, yeah, como
That
para
with the
tener,
line breaks, it gets.
yeah. Yeah, so you can use them or not use them. Ya depende de
Sorry,
cada quien, ¿verdad? But
I
yes,
gotcha.
yeah. Is there anyone else that would like to add another? Si no, está bien. De todos modos, aquí les estoy presentando uno de mis poemas. Just so that I can illustrate how I like to use enjambment, as Abraham suggested. So this is one of my poems, se llama Origami. And this poem I wrote many years ago for my girlfriend. And I do anticipate actually publishing it as part of a book in the future that I already have a title for. Se llama 20,000 palabras. But as you can see, the poem reads, and again, pay attention to the enjambment, the way that I use enjambment. My paper monsters inhabit the penumbra of radiant words you pluck from stars woven in my body. Your tapestry of kisses and clippings of poetry I've scrawled in past lives leading up to this moment. I've come to you, amor. The reason my destiny kept me patching art works in fragments across my spine and arms, fingers laced in hairs and verbs, adjectives that can never be sufficient in describing you, cariño, you, my lady of desire, lady of my core. Release my beasts and play origami again. So here, release my beasts, como ven, is probably a more traditional line break, right? It reads like a statement. And play origami again also reads like a statement, ¿verdad? Pero si vamos acá arriba, estoy usando encabalgamiento. And these specific uses of enjambment, at least the way that I like to approach my poetry, help to create this kind of, they are juxtapositions, right? Words you pluck is kind of like a statement. It reads like a statement. Here, my body, your tapestry, that's a juxtaposition, right? Because I'm taking two ideas and I'm putting them together on the same line. And it's not directly saying that it's a metaphor, but it's creating a visual relationship that is the same as a metaphor. ¿Verdad? And then as you continue on, because of the way that the grammar is, indicated through the use of commas, right? You have to read on your tapestry of kisses and clippings of poetry, right? You have to read to the next line if you want to complete the sentence. So you have to keep on reading until it comes to the next comma here, right? So that's how enjambment works in my poetry. That's my approach. That's my specific poetics. Now, you can experiment with these different techniques as much as you like. You don't have to write the way that I do. That's my unique way of approaching poetry. Y al último, eso es lo que les quiero dejar para quizás su tarea, ¿verdad? Quiero darles esta palabra, poetics, poética. La poética viene siendo un tratado o colección de notas sobre la estética, expresado en poesía o prosa. It doesn't have to be a poem. It can also be written in prose, but poetics is the fancy term for a treatise or a collection of notes on aesthetics. And aesthetics is ultimately what is one of the bases for these line breaks. This is the way that it looks. It's also the way that you approach poetry. Those are your aesthetics. Así que su poética es algo que van a ir formando durante los años. Right? This isn't something that you're going to come across from one day to the next. If you've been writing poetry for a long time, you might have already your own aesthetics. You might have your own poetics, as we would call it in writing. Y para darles un ejemplo de un ars poética, un arte poética, aquí les presento este poema de Vicente Huidobro. A lot of you in the class have probably seen this before. You might know, right, that it's my one of my favorite poems, because Huidobro himself, wrote this poem kind of like as a way of giving himself advice, but also advice to others. Y para los que no conocen a Vicente Huidobro, es un poeta chileno que vivió del año 1893 al año 1948. And he was kind of like an avant-garde poet. Some of his poetry is a little inaccessible, I do have to admit. Es un poco difícil a veces leer su poesía, pero aparte de eso, es uno de los ejemplos que en Latinoamérica sí tenemos una tradición muy rica de poesía vanguardista. When people think of Latin America, they don't often know that we have a shit ton of poets, and we do. We have a lot of very, very influential writers, and Vicente Huidobro happened to be one of them. So we have here, like I said, Ars Poetica, and this specifically comes from his book El Espejo de Agua, The Mirror of Water, which was published in 1916. We don't have to read the poem if y'all don't want to, but I do think it's worth hearing it at least once read out loud. So do I have a volunteer that would like to read it for us? We don't have to analyze it. Like I said, just we can hear it. Sam, since you know Huidobro, would you like to give it a shot?
Yeah, give it a shot. English or in Spanish?
Como quieras.
El que sea?
El que sea.
All right, I'll shoot for the Spanish. Que el verso sea como una llave, que abra mil puertas. Una hoja cae, algo pasa volando. Cuanto miren los ojos, creado sea, y el alma del oyente quede temblando. Inventa mundos nuevos y cuida tu palabra. El adjetivo, cuando no da vida, mata. Estamos en el ciclo de los nervios. El músculo cuelga como recuerdo en los museos. Mas no por eso tenemos menos fuerza. El vigor verdadero reside en la cabeza. ¿Por qué cantáis la rosa? Oh, poetas, hacedla florecer en el poema. Solo para nosotros viven todas las cosas bajo el sol. El poeta es un pequeño Dios.
Exactly. Thank you, Sam. And do I have a volunteer that'd like to read it in English for us?
I can do it.
All right.
I mean, I usually read the Spanish, but me ganaron. Just kidding. Just kidding. All right. Let me see if I can do the English. Okay. May the verse, okay, let me calm down because it's not supposed to be that loud. May the verse be as a key. May it open 1,000 doors. A leaf falls, something flies by. May all that is seen be created, and the soul of the listener be left trembling. Invent new worlds and safeguard your word. The adjective, when not a life giver, kills. We are in the cycle of nerves. The muscle hangs like a memory in the museums. In spite of this, we are not any less strong. True vigor resides in the head. Why do you sing the rose, O poets? Make it bloom in the poem. Only for us do all things live under the sun. The poet is a minor god.
Excellent.
Muchas gracias.
If I could whistle, I would. Thank you, San Juanita. Thank you. Thank you, Sam, as well. You both knocked it out of the park. So, like I said, we don't have to really discuss it too much. Si tienen alguna pregunta, por favor, pueden preguntarlo cuando quieran. But ultimately, I think that, you know, what I like about this poem and why I like to revisit this poem is because the advice that Vicente Huidobro gives us is, I think, pretty clear, especially in this line right here. The adjective, when not a life giver, kills. El adjetivo, cuando no da vida, mata. it's ultimately saying that we need to be very picky about the words that we use, right? Igual como dijo Eduardo Galeano, ¿verdad? Las palabras que usamos las tenemos que cuidar, porque si nos hacemos nudos, si nos hacemos bola, ese hilo que es la vida, ese hilo que es nuestro texto, hay que decir, nos puede trabar, ¿verdad? It can get in our way. And so we, as poets, should always strive to tell the story that we want to tell in a way that makes people, again, feel it, right? We feel it the most when it's speaking to our emotions and when it's clear. And we can experiment with these other techniques, right? We can experiment with enjambment. We can experiment with the way that simple line breaks, give us new images, right? We want to make all the roses bloom in our poems. That's why we need to be direct in our language. Poetry is not some academic thing, right? It's not something that only the rich have access to. Poetry is actually something that we do every single day just by living and breathing. Así que si quieren hacer esta tarea que les voy a dar, pues lo pueden hacer. Es opcional. But this has been a project that I personally have been wanting to do for a very long time. And I encourage you to do it as well. I would encourage you to write a poem that reflects on your unique relationship with art and poetry, and then revisit that same poem every few weeks, every few months, or every few years. The most important thing that you can do for yourself is observe how your relationship with poetry and art evolves over time. The more often you do this particular exercise, the more you'll see that you will begin to develop your own poetics. You will begin to develop your own style. Cada mundo, cada cabeza es su propio mundo. Eso sí es muy cierto. Y al hacer esta tarea, si es que se deciden hacerlo, van a ir formando su propio estilo de poética, su propio, pues sí, su propia poética, su propio estilo de escribir. Así que es opcional, no lo tienen que entregar. Obviously, this particular class isn't gonna last for more than the 15 weeks that we've already allotted, right? But this is a great exercise for us to have as poets, as artists, until the day that we stop creating. So, again, you're welcome to do this particular exercise as homework. And if you'd like to share it with us, you're more than welcome to do so. We won't be giving you feedback on this particular prompt this time around, but it could be maybe one of the first poems that you bring to us if you want to incorporate it into our upcoming zine, Conchas y Café zine. ¿Hay por ahí alguna pregunta? Does anyone have any final comments or questions before we close out our session tonight? Or just thoughts that you'd like to share?
Luis, I think the saying is something like what you're saying. I think it's cada persona es dueño de su propio mundo.
Yeah, también.
Is that it?
That could be one.
I think I heard it. It's been bugging me the whole time. I'm like, I know I heard that differently. Okay, that's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure there's other ways of saying that particular idiom, but yeah. I see a hand from Julie and then San Juanita.
Yeah, so I'm not really totally clear. Do we have a homework assignment, which is what you just read us? Or what are we supposed to do for next week?
The only homework that you actually do have, which I posted in Google Classroom, and Julie, you already completed it, so you're good. But it is to download the orientation packet if you have not yet, and print and sign the media release that's on the very last page. So that is the one main homework assignment that everybody does have that isn't part of the handout. This other one that I just gave you now, it's not really a homework. It's more of a life work or a life homework, if you want to think of it that way. You don't have to turn it in. It's optional this particular week. But it's definitely a good activity to do on a regular basis as a writer. Write a poem that
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah, it is an optional, it's an optional thing, but next week we're going to get our real assignment.
Right.
For our homework. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, to answer Tori's question about the media release, yes, you can scan it and send it that way instead of printing it, or you can do it digitally as well. San Juanita?
My question is around what Julie just said. Now I'm like, why is he giving us an option? Why isn't he telling us that we have to do it,
Yeah.
So I was thinking maybe we're doing it differently this time, because I noticed you have session 1 and session 2, and that's it. Session 1 in the fall, session 1 in the spring. We used to have 3, no? Más antes?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh,
And
no.
we also
Maybe I'm
have
wrong. I don't
less
know.
weeks. So we went from having way back in the day, for those that don't know, it used to be quarterly. So we actually had 10-week sessions, and we did that, 4 times a year. And then people wanted more time to do their writing. So we added a couple of weeks, and it became 12-week series that we did 3 times a year. And now we've added again more weeks. So now we're at 15 weeks, but we're doing it now twice a year. So fall and spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're still doing the publishing and all that.
Right.
I just wanna, yeah. So it's just gonna be 2 of 15 weeks, but you're still gonna ask us to do homework.
Yes.
I'm like, what is going on? There's no homework.
Yeah.
So let me do the.
Today is like a
I
practice.
didn't do the paper right.
Yeah. So today's homework, again, like I said,
Thank you.
This is like a life work thing, right? So, this is not just about, developing the skills to analyze poetry, but it's also about analyzing yourself, right? And your relationship with poetry. And that's ultimately what I hope you take from tonight's session. How do you interpret poetry for yourself? And how do you hope that other people will interpret it as well when you write it, when you present it? You can use some of the techniques that we went over today for your own writing. And these are techniques that you can look for in other people's writing, because again, workshopping and sharing your work with others is a very important part of this particular series. Conchas y Café is about having that space to not only create, but also to get feedback on your writing. Así que esta tarea es como una práctica para ustedes. Pero las técnicas que repasamos hoy, eso sí es algo que espero que usen en las próximas semanas. No solo en sus tareas que sí van a entregar, pero también en las anotaciones que van a dar sobre los trabajos que se les entrega a ustedes. Life just keeps you away. Well, a little bit of writing here and there won't hurt nobody. Fit it in when you can. But yes, again, just to be clear, next week you will get your very first homework assignment that is specifically for the theme, which is life's paths, los caminos de la vida. And that homework is going to be a homework that we hope you do turn in for the very first workshopping session, which will be 2 weeks from today. But next week, Abraham is going to be actually kicking off the lessons that are specific to the theme. Yeah. Abraham, the one que los hace sufrir. All right. So if there are no other questions, then we'll go ahead and call it a night. Thank you, everyone, for logging on. Those of you that logged on Instagram Live or on YouTube or Facebook Live, again, you're welcome to still sign up. There's still a chance to sign up for the class on Google Classroom. Just visit our website, distillarts.org/conchasycafezine. Y con eso, que se la pasen muy bien, que descansen, drink plenty of water. And if you are in the East LA area this weekend, on Saturday, we will see you at the East Los Book Festival at the East LA Civic Center. So, por ahí nos vemos. Have a good week, everybody.
Hasta luego.
Hasta luego.